Hello, everyone, and welcome to Relief, Recovery, and Resilience, HIV Voting in the Time of COVID-19. This webinar is the latest in AIDS United series examining the myriad ways that COVID-19 pandemic has been impacting people living with HIV and many issues that intersect with the work we do as HIV advocates. My name is Drew Gibson. I'm a policy manager for HIV and drug user health here at AIDS United. Just wanted to start off by thinking back on where we were 4 years ago. In 2016, AIDS United's then Vice President of Policy and Advocacy, Ronald Johnson, wrote an article in anticipation of the upcoming election, highlighting the fact that voting is a vital form of HIV advocacy. Please do not be complacent, he wrote at the time. The differences between the candidates are real, and so will be the consequences of this election. It's your life and it's your vote. Use it as if your life depended on it, because it may. Today, nearly 4 years after those words were published, their prescience and truth are clearer than ever. As we approach the 2020 election, our health and well-being as individuals, as an HIV community, and as a nation are in dire straits. As I speak these words, nearly 200,000 people have died from COVID-19 in America, and another 200,000 are expected to die before year's end. Millions of people are facing the dual threats of homelessness and joblessness due to the pandemic. At the same time, the stock market has soared, and the rich continue to accrue wealth. All across the country, communities are fighting back against the systemic oppression of Black people by law enforcement and white supremacy in all its manifestations. And at all levels of government, the voting rights of the American people, and particularly the voting rights of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, are under attack to a degree we haven't seen in over 50 years. It is not hyperbole to say that the 2020 election may well be the most important election of our lifetimes. Because of this and the unique nature of this election due to the threats of COVID-19 and widespread voter suppression, AIDS United has invited 3 amazing HIV and electoral organizers to participate in today's webinar. Over the next hour, our panelists will discuss how they are preparing for the 2020 election, what obstacles people living with HIV may face as they look to cast their ballot this year, and what steps they can take to ensure that their vote is counted. We will have roughly 15 minutes for each presenter to give their remarks, followed by, at the end, between 10 and 15 minutes for Q&A. There is a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen with Zoom, and AIDS United staff will be monitoring those as we go forward. Our first panelist today, also need to add that this webinar is also available in Spanish, and that you can click on the interpretation button at the bottom to listen to the webinar using our Spanish translator. Our first panelist today is Anoa Changa. Anoa is a staff reporter for PRISM, a Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led nonprofit news outlet that centers the people, places, and issues currently underreported by national media. Anoa is responsible for leading PRISM's coverage of electoral justice and voting rights, a role that builds upon her years of experience as an organizer, lawyer, and movement journalist. Prior to working with PRISM, Anoa worked at the New Georgia Project, a nonpartisan effort to register and civically engage Georgian voters, where she was the director of digital strategy and storytelling, and at Democracy for America, where she held the position of city's electoral manager. Anoa is the host of the podcast, The Way with Anoa, tackling politics and current events through a Black progressive feminist perspective. She also has bylines in The Independent, The Nation, Dame Magazine, Huffington Post, and Rewire News. Please join me in welcoming Anoa Changa.
Thank you so much, Drew. Really appreciate being able to be here and share some thoughts with everyone today. You make me sound so good. Hopefully I live up to it. So just thinking about this election cycle, right? I mean, it's wild. A lot of people kept claiming we would not still be in this moment in terms of the pandemic heading into November election. And we see many states and voting rights organizers and advocates across the country working really hard right now to make sure that folks can access the ballot without having to compromise their health. And this is something that's also very personal to me as someone who is in the high risk category for COVID. So I have been following all the different developments very furiously, not just for work, but also just in my own personal capacity. I'm based in Georgia, which is like ground zero for voter suppression and voting rights work right now. And so all of this kind of informs my view and lens in the way I do coverage. When I think about this election cycle, as well as the escalating political tensions we're seeing amongst the major parties, and what we're seeing in terms of racial justice uprisings happening across the country, I find really strength and grounding in the words and work of Ida B. Wells. So I just want to share a quote with you all. With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. Ida B. Wells wrote those words in 1910, so 10 years before white women were given the right to vote. Ida B. Wells wrote those words in a pamphlet she wrote, How Enfranchisement Stopped Lynchings. And so, she also went on to say that denying the right to vote also emboldens the denying of, in that case, she was talking about Black people specifically, and lynching, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what has been really, really great for me to learn as I stepped into journalism over this past year was about the way in which folks like Ida B. Wells did not just try to be relegated to one lane or another, but actually looked at the full scope of their life and their work and how it could contribute and build up their communities. Which brings me to our next slide. I just wanted to give a little quick background about electoral justice and what that means for me as a staff reporter at PRISM. So, I have a couple of pictures up here of some of the recent work I've done, but electoral justice is a concept that exists outside of, organizing movement spaces. But we take the definition of electoral justice kind of from the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Roundtable and that work that looks at the process of engaging in, civic life and political work as more than just turning people out for particular election cycles, but looking at a more holistic approach in which we're engaging people around the issues and conditions that matter directly in their lives, right? So not just, hey, you need to show up and cast a ballot for X person, but let's also build with you year round to figure out how do we get you more civically engaged, to also figure out how do we help you meet your needs. So it's a more comprehensive approach to engaging in political work. And so for me as a staff reporter, that looks like not just, centering the words and work of, elected officials or other government officials who may be leading, different agencies, particularly when we're talking about, Secretary of State's offices or county boards of elections, but also looking at the organizing work that is happening in many instances. I often being based in the South, I focus heavily on the South at times, but the work that's being organized by people who are directly in connection with their communities and these systems. So just a couple of the recent articles, just to give you a brief overview. Something that has been a big deal since we've been talking a lot about vote by mail in the past several months, but it's been something that has been really churned out by particular political folks with a particular political suasion, claims of fraud. So the first article here is about voter fraud claims and criminal task force. In Georgia and in West Virginia, I believe was the other state that did this, there was a task force created to address the non-existent scourge of voter fraud. And it was mostly white prosecutors made up this task force. And we just had the Secretary of State here in Georgia announce allegedly 1,000 people double voted in our primary, which was extremely confusing for a lot of us in many states, given many of the delays, the changes, the switches, the uncertainty around ballots, et cetera. So there was widespread confusion across the state, and allegedly there were 1,000 people across the state that may have double voted. And there's no indication that people did this intentionally. And then, for the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, I wrote about voting as a means to an end, not the end goal. And a lot of that centers on the work, as I mentioned earlier, of Ida B. Wells and other Black suffragists who looked at voting as a tool. You'll often hear a lot of folks in organized space talk about voting as a tool, for whatever other work they're doing. And I'm sure the same holds with the work that you all are doing as well to advance different agendas, but voting itself is not the end goal. And then, looking at addressing the election disinformation that comes from the current president. I mean, there is a lot of attention paid to objectivity, but not necessarily really digging in on how detrimental having false statements about the election, about voting processes, about our democracy really undermines these principles and values. And then the other two look at just community organizing, how we build beyond the height of emergency. So when we're really thinking about like what's going on right now in terms of the election and what our options are in terms of, getting out to vote and doing extra work, we can go to the next slide. there are challenges that are facing voters across the board. And particularly when we're talking about the triple pandemics of white supremacy, economic injustice, and COVID-19 that are affecting many of our communities, right? So like all of these things are factoring into how we're engaging with voter engagement and voter turnout. So when we're thinking about like these challenges, it can be daunting, but it's a good time to take a deep breath and just really be clear about what are our options, what are the issues that are being presented, and then how do we move forward? And I think that if you're newer to doing work around voter engagement or the scaled up level of voter engagement that's happening right now, it is a really good opportunity to see if there are any local voting rights groups. A lot of the voting rights orgs tend to be 501c3 as well, who might be interested in partnering on some initiatives. So, a lot of this is challenging even under quote unquote normal circumstances, but we're in a moment that's anything but normal. So vote by mail has been like the big push in many instances in terms of like, how do we vote in a pandemic? How do we show up? But I mean, for a lot of us, vote by mail actually means having individuals request absentee ballots, since the majority of the country does not have a vote by mail system. There are only 5 states that actually have a vote by all mail system. And the difference matters because in an all mail system, you have the state recognizing all their eligible voters and sending them their ballot. And then they have their voting period, they return their ballots, that's it. When we're talking about scaling up absentee ballot use, particularly when you have states that are not used to having the large volume of absentee ballots that we have seen, it can cause many other issues. So like really listening and trying to check in to see how your county boards of elections, your state election board, and your Secretary of State are handling the influx of absentee ballots could also be useful in terms of the advocacy and work that you're doing, possibly around vote by mail. The ACLU, I thought this was a really cool gift to show while I was sitting here talking to you, but also recently I just learned that the ACLU in Tennessee just launched a campaign effort around helping to engage people around vote by mail and early voting in Tennessee, for example. But it's also understanding like what are the rules around absentee ballot use, right? Most states do allow absentee ballots for any reason, right? You don't need to state a reason. Anyone who is an eligible voter can get an absentee ballot. However, you do have states that have what they call an excuse requirement. Texas is one of the major ones. I think Breanna might talk a little bit more about this, but Texas is one of the major ones. Mississippi is another one that have not actually expanded the use of absentee ballots to everyone, but they have this weird caveat around susceptibility. In Texas is around susceptibility to COVID-19, along with a fear of or underlying physical health conditions. So it's like understanding how these states that are saying that if you have potentially like a health condition that could make you higher at risk for COVID-19, if that could make people in the populations you're working with more, make them available to using an absentee ballot, then that's something to kind of work through and understand. But it's different in each state. So if you are an organization that works across multiple states, like having your staff that may be assigned to one state or another, understanding more about how absentee ballot use works in that particular state is really crucial, because what Kentucky is doing, for example, which is, a neighbor of Tennessee, is very different than what Tennessee is doing if you were working in both states, for example. In Kentucky, the governor there, Governor Beshear, issued an executive order and made it possible for everyone to use absentee ballots. In Tennessee, it's very limited to only those people who have an underlying health condition that puts them at risk. And so when we're talking about like some of the issues with vote by mail, one of the things that we've seen a lot about is with the Postal Service in terms of how there are delays and other issues. I mean, if you're going to rely on vote by mail on absentee ballots as your mechanism of engaging or participating in the election, then you need to be applying for your ballot ASAP and returning it as soon as possible, right? Do not delay, because in many states, you do not have the option of, as long as it's postmarked by a certain date and received by a certain date, it will be counted. In most states, it has to be either the day, if you have an absentee ballot, it has to either be received before the day before the election or the day of the election by whatever times the polls would close, right? And so understanding those things, as well as what are your other options. If you do request the ballot and it does not come in time, it's not, oh, well, I just didn't get my ballot. Like understanding what other options. Do you have early voting? Can you vote in person? And if you've requested a ballot, but then something comes up and you're no longer able to submit that ballot you requested, how do you then basically vacate the ballot and then go ahead and vote in person. Because what we have seen time and again, I just listened to a bunch of cases on a state election board call earlier today where people inadvertently, in good faith, but made mistakes and are still having their cases referred to the Attorney General's office here. So understanding the rules and the law and advising people to the best of your ability accordingly. If you need to reach out to one of the legal organizations that do voting rights work, like the Lawyers Committee or Advancement Project or the ACLU, to get better clarification, that is also super helpful. And then we need to make sure that we're talking to folks about what are the alternatives for returning, you know, like, so if you're in a state that has made provisions for drop boxes and stuff, right? Like, so, you know, we do have the ability to have drop boxes here. South Carolina is currently considering legislation that would allow for everyone to vote absentee ballot in the election, but they have not made a provision for drop boxes. So people will either have to mail in their ballot or they will have to return it to their local county board. So it just depends upon, it's so state specific. So it's really important to understand those rules. And then once you understand the rules though, it's just about communicating to folks so that folks have the step-by-step so they can take advantage and do it themselves. And, you know, something that we're thinking about as we're looking forward to the election is because of the volume of absentee ballots we saw in New York, it took like a week or two for some of the elections in New York to actually be called officially because of the volume of absentee ballots. It's possible that, you know, election night might be more like an election week or election 2 weeks. And one thing we need to just talk about with our folks that we work with, and I think this is really important conversations people in media are having, is how do we talk about the potential waiting game and making sure that people understand that that there are going to be, you know, possible delays, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anything is happening, you know, that's nefarious or anything. It's just because we now have to count and make sure everyone's votes counted. And I think centering on, you know, making sure that all votes are counted is extremely important. And when we're thinking about just how to move collectively, I know it's important to, you know, we talk about one person, one vote, but as networks of people, as collectives, it's really, really important that we bring our whole networks into the process with us, right? It's not about whether or not we're getting involved in the partisan nature of everything. It's about how many people we have showing up and engaging in our collective democracy and making sure that we are all doing our part to move collectively forward. So there is like extreme power and collective engagement in our elections. And the last thing I'm gonna lead everybody on is just really understanding the importance and difference between misinformation, disinformation, and helping our folks, whether they're friends or family, people we're working with, to not not share, you know, bad facts, right? You know, PEN America, I have a colleague, Nora Benavides, who's an attorney who works with PEN America. She recently released a guide about how to talk to your friends and family about misinformation and disinformation. Now, these are two, they go hand in hand, but disinformation is the intentional use or explaining or sharing bad information or distorted information. Misinformation is when someone just sees something and in good faith is resharing it. And we've seen a lot of disinformation, whether it's the foreign interference we've heard so much about, or we've seen certain individuals sharing intentionally misinforming. And then the last thing, it's slightly off topic, but super related. The end of the month is the census deadline. If you have not already completed the census, definitely encourage your folks to complete the census and definitely complete it yourself. It is, everyone who lives in the United States should complete the census. It is another tool to determine the support and funding for our communities, as well as making sure we have representation. You know, the US Census is used to determine redistricting and drawing of congressional lines, and then many states and localities also use it to draw the lines for their other races. So whether it's school board, city council, et cetera. So I'm going to kick it back over to the team, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Anoa. That was a great presentation, and we'll definitely look forward to hearing from you more during the Q&A section. I know it's really hard to distill all that information down into 15 minutes, but we're still on track. So our next presenter is Maxx Boykin. Maxx is the Policy and Organizing Manager at Black AIDS Institute. Boykin, formerly a member of the Black Treatment AIDS Advocates Network, BTAN, the Chicago chapter, joined the BAI team in January of 2018 and leads BTAN along with policy advocacy and mobilization efforts of the Black AIDS Institute. At his heart, he is an organizer, activist, and believer in we have to be the change we want to see. Over the past few years, Maxx has been a part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health Leaders, which along with his team has created the Organizing Health Institute as a part of Reimagine Health, which works to connect, train, and help support social justice campaigns, connecting both people who work in health with people who work in social justice. Before coming to BAI and moving back to Atlanta, he was the manager of organizing at the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, along with the manager of HIV Prevention Justice Alliance. Boykin is also a member of Black Youth Project 100, a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health Leader, and is on the steering committee for the collaboration on health equity for Cook County. Please join me in welcoming Maxx Boykin.
Hey y'all, hope y'all can hear me all right. Thank you so very much for that introduction, Drew. And Noah, thank you just for setting us up and talking about some important pieces around our election work and why it's important here. Next slide, please. What I'm gonna talk to you all about is how in which we at the Black AIDS Institute have gotten to the point where we're working on this election work. This is not something that we have historically done a ton of, but we have also always worked to mobilize Black people in order to end the HIV epidemic within the Black community, and understanding within the Black community, we are ending it practically in other parts of not just the parts that are deeply impacted in this country, and making sure that we're doing it from the people that are most marginalized within our community. And I'll be talking a little bit around these two pieces, the Black of the Plan, which connects to our We the People report that came out earlier this year, and how that connects to our Black of the Vote work that we're doing from now to the end of the year. Next slide. Here, as I was saying, this has been definitely a tough year, and some statements that are important for us to understand as we move forward as BAI and just our continued work this year and for the coming years. We understand that Black Lives Matter. That is not a question for us. But we also understand that Black people living with HIV matter. Black LGBTQ lives matter. Black transgender lives matter. And truly that all Black lives have to matter. And for, I think, part of this election and this piece that we are talking about here is, are we going to stand up for everybody? Are we going to make sure that everyone is actually included within this? And as we want to make sure that the communities that are typically most marginalized, most not talked about, not engaged with, are engaged through our work. And some of the work and history of what HIV has done gets us closer to that point. Now, this next statement I have comes from a person who I've admired over the years, and a person from the same city I'm from in Atlanta. It's your duty to fortify your own house, so that you may be a house of refuge in times of organization. Now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. The importance when we hear those words, and this happened right after Rashad Brooks was killed in a Wendy's parking lot, and him addressing the city of Atlanta. And it's an important thing as a person who also was a part of protests, been a part of protests over the years, but especially protests after seeing the death of Rashad Brooks. Also, in seeing what we needed to do, I also understood as the person that leads our Black Treatment Advocates Network that we also have to have this time and our spaces, our 501c3s, and some of us I know have C4s, whatever base, whatever community we have, this is the time to organize. This is the time for us to plan, strategize, and think about how we get to those larger goals that we want to get to, which includes ending the HIV epidemic in this country. Next slide. And the Black AIDS Institute, who has been, this is our 21-year anniversary. We are a national HIV and AIDS think tank, focused on ending the HIV epidemic within the Black community. And with understanding all those pieces, next slide, we do that through different policies, conducting trainings, offering technical assistance. But we also understand that one of the things that we do is help mobilize people. So what we did all of last year, we worked really hard on making sure that we created our new report. This is our report that was coming under Ronnie Copeland, our new CEO's leadership. It was our first team with the policy and organizing team, which I am a part of as the policy and organizing manager. And we came up with 4 key pillars. The first one really dealing with changing policies that have to be done and creating coalitions of people, creating that power that we want to see to be able to change the policies in our community. Second pillar being focused on the social determinants of health. And the third pillar being focused on our access to healthcare, which we have seen continuous attacks on, especially after over the last 4 years. But that fourth one is building the capacity and building the capacity and motivation of Black communities to be the change agents for ending the HIV community. And then in connecting that first and fourth pillar, important things to think about is we have to continue to engage and build up our communities. But we also have to build the power to be able to change the policies that we want to see. And also with changing that policy, we have to make sure that our people have full access to rights to vote. And that includes people that are formerly incarcerated. It includes people that are actually also incarcerated, many times not even understanding how in which that takes away their access to voting. We have to make sure that our Black trans brothers and sisters are also, our gender non-conforming folks are being engaged within this voting work. We have to think about the different ways and think about ways that are outside of the norm to engage voters. That's an important piece. Something that isn't talked about a lot of times is Black young people, Black millennials actually voted a higher rate than the white and Latinx counterparts. That's something that isn't talked about enough. Many times we generally talk about millennials not going out to vote. We talk about HIV, disproportionately new rates between 18 to 24, especially for Black, gay, same-gender loving, bisexual men. What are we doing to actually thinking about specifically engaging them? And some of the ways that we have done mobilization work over the years is actually very helpful in the ways that we think about engaging our folks to vote. Next slide. A key piece of this is our base. The base for the Black AIDS Institute is the Black Treatment Advocates Network. We have 24 chapters and affiliates across the country. We work a lot on health literacy, understanding the background of the health pieces. We also understand and focus on the political education of it. We have to understand who is making the decisions around our policies and understanding who are those individuals. So this is over time. This is not something that we just created. The Black Treatment Advocates Network has been around for 10 years. I actually came out of BTAN. We have many different BTAN leaders who have been doing different work, be it on COVID response, doing election work, being on social justice responses, and understanding how all these different things impact their day-to-day lives, but also thinking about the key part in that part connected to the We the People pillar 4 and also our Black Treatment Advocates Network is always mobilizing Black folks to be able to be that change. And thinking about some of the ways that we were able to do that earlier in the year and get into our election piece. Next slide. When all this was happening throughout the year, we had a number of different engagement opportunities. I think we did have one election plan that we thought was possible, but then COVID-19 hit. We stopped traveling. We didn't do our in-person retreat. We didn't do any of the events that we thought, a lot of the events that we thought we were going to be able to do, we had to switch them up, and they had to be switched to doing more virtual work. As you see here on this slide, you got a couple slides from both our Florida and Arkansas We the People town halls. These were opportunities for folks to engage where they talked about COVID-19. They talked about the different things that are impacting Black community, but within that, we also started to engage and talk about what it meant. You know, voting was brought up in most of our town halls, the importance of going out to vote this year. And then we also had a series around COVID-19. We've had 2 different ones. One is our conversations on COVID-19 in Black communities, which has been in partnership with Maxx, House of Blonic, CFARS, and formerly SEC, and working around how in which we talk about the different ways that this pandemic has impacted us, from reopening too soon to what was going on with our different states. So talking about the difference of politics and the history of medical mistrust and why that impacts all of this. And even talking about what these uprisings meant, especially happening in June and July. BAI also put out a statement of understanding why Black lives not just matter, but what HIV community has to do more than just saying the words of saying that Black people matter. And they're also thinking about Black of the Plan series, where we've talked to different experts around mental health during this time. Talked to Dr. Anthony Fauci most recently about some of what our community needs to know, and trying to to create a place where folks can get that proper information, getting the most up-to-date information. That is important, and to keep our network continue to move throughout this time period. It's been hard. We're not meeting in person. Typically, when you think about election engagement, you're thinking about in-person engagement. We've had to shift that because we want to keep our community and our people as safe as possible, while also being able to talk to them about the importance of voting and educating why this election matters. I think many people do know why this election matters, but don't know the ways in which they can engage more people or ways in which they can engage people safely. That is one of the things in the big crux and in the difficult part a little bit about 2020. It's one of the many difficult parts of 2020. But as we continue to think about this, we're thinking about, okay, how do we start to work with our folks? Well, there are folks who have a deeper relationship with elections work. I do have a background in elections work. I did work on foreign elections to 2010 to 2013, and taking that work and thinking about how we can use our network to continue to engage even more voters. But definitely couldn't do it by ourselves. Next slide. We had to think about how in which we do this in a way that brings a little bit more folks together. With that, how in which we do that piece, really important is partnership. And the importance of partnership is important. Breanna is going to talk about what they've been doing at the Positive Women's Network and getting out the vote there. And we have some natural partnership because of where our Black Treatment Advocates Network aligns with PWN, and just also sharing out the wonderful resources that they've been doing. We also have had a connection with registers to get more people registered to vote with Headcount. Headcount has a simple QR code that we have now put on our different things, and you'll see at the end of this presentation to say how in which we get more folks connected to getting that vote out. And then we have also connected with the Movement for Black Lives that we sit on the policy and organizing table as well, and have been building those relationships to also connect with what they've been doing over the last couple of months, which has been Freedom Summer, and now also the Fall Fellowship to also engage more organizations and entities to get that overall more Black votes out, to be able to share lists, connect our people to the work that they're also doing, and see how we can engage that. Next slide. The important piece that I want to uplift is this piece around the Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer is something that is really important, because many times we think about the policies that we want to engage. We want to engage and get the We the People report, all the wonderful policies that we want out of that to engage in and continue to pass. And with the Movement for Black Lives, they are also trying to pass the BREATHE Act, which is around criminal justice reform, among other things around just ending this war on Black people that our continued policies in the United States tend to do. And when we think about the history of Freedom Summer in '64, which led to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, helped focus on voter suppression, talked about those issues, that there were problems in Mississippi, while also working to engage to get more voters out. And we saw young people across the country doing that this summer, both in person and virtually, to engage that. And we are also working within that to talk about how in which we connect these different issues to this. So it's also connecting a history, something to the past, to what we are definitely fighting for right now, and connecting HIV to the larger issues of ending the war on Black people and making sure our people can live long, healthy lives. Last slide. So to bring all that together, the major things that we wanted to bring in within this, and truly important around this, is you got to get our folks out to register to vote. It's not easy to register to vote. We have to focus on this in a very short period of time, understanding that some people, this ain't been the focus of their lives because COVID-19 has been impacting them. They're trying to make sure that they get their meds around, if it's PrEP or their ARTs. They're trying to make sure that they're keeping their jobs, all those things. So we're going to have a huge media blitz along with within our network and also on social media, talking about the census and the importance of voting. We have a big, voter registration day. And as you see on this slide, the QR code is right there. That is something you can hang up in your clinic, that you can put up anywhere. And we're having our BTANs do it, put it in their clinics, we'll also be in our clinic back in LA when it's fully back open and running, for folks to just be able to take that picture, lead them through the way to be able to register to vote. It doesn't have no paper contact, but we still know who is using it because of our partnership with Headcount, and also using that to also get more of our folks registered to vote, and in a safe way. Other things that we want to think about when we're doing this is voting by mail. We're going to focus on a voting by mail structure for right now. we understand it to be the safest way, and for all of our places where they can have access to it, and also getting them connected to the right information. The wonderful thing about partnership with Headcount, they have all that information there on our website. It makes it easier for folks to just go get that information real quick. We also want people then to also, as we get closer to the election, especially understanding the importance of, for the HIV community, the United States Conference on HIV and AIDS that this year is going to be in October. We're going to be switching messaging from, as you know, like, we know there's only a certain time that you can actually mail in your ballot. Make sure you're going to get it there. As we get closer, we're going to say, hey, people being able to vote early. Now, we know some states may not have the same, and we know not all states will have the same early day voting, but again, making sure that folks are getting that information for those last 2 weeks. Then also encouraging people to have a plan of action on election day will also be an important thing, and getting more people out to vote. The importance of vote tripling, which in that partnership is really using a tailored down message of what we talk about with neighborhood team models, or even our way in which we organize, getting more people engaged with us. The ways in which we do that is making sure that the average voter didn't text a couple more voters, and then we text 10 more voters. And every time that we're doing that, we're engaging a larger list to build our list internally within our own organization, but also making it so we are increasing everyone's chance to vote. And every little text and the direct ask messaging that we will be sending, especially closer to the election, really starting in October, is going to be important for us getting that total vote out. Every little bit counts. And then also getting people the right information, cutting through the mess that we constantly are going to be bombarded with by these different ads. People are looking to trusted sites, such as our 501c3s, to understand, to get the proper information where they can vote, how they vote, and then making sure that they understand the importance of voting. With that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm excited for all the questions that folks may have. I'm excited to let Breanna really tail in with this wonderful presentation she's about to do.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. We'll hear from you more in a little bit during the question and answer section. Now we're moving on to our final presenter for today, Breanna Diaz. Breanna is the Policy Director for the Positive Women's Network, USA, where she advocates for women and people of transgender experience living with HIV in the areas of criminal justice, healthcare, reproductive rights, safety, and justice. Breanna is a queer Latinx woman whose lived experience deeply informs her advocacy. She received her law degree from American University, Washington College of Law. Please join me in welcoming Breanna Diaz.
Hey, thank you so much for that really kind intro, Drew. I'm happy to finish this lovely presentation with the work that PWN is doing. Yeah, could we get to my slides? Great, yeah, so I'm gonna talk about Vote Positive USA. It is a part of PWN. It is its own C4 entity that we have. So Vote Positive USA is separate from the PWN C3 capacity, but I'm sure you've heard a lot about Vote Positive USA in our work, and if not, I'm here to talk about what it is and how you can get involved. So yeah, next slide. I know everyone before me has already gone over quite a bit about the 2020 election and what we know, what's at stake for our community, right? We know that that marginalized communities have had a very difficult 4 years, and we know that this next election will really dictate what the next 4 years look like for us. A lot of issues are on the line for us, for the LGBTQ community, for BIPOC, for low to no income folks, and many other. So yeah, we know what's at stake, and we should definitely do what we can to organize folks to show up in 2020. Next slide. We also know that elections have consequences. The presenters before me really touched on this, that when we don't show up, we don't mobilize and organize our communities to inform them, how to register to vote, what mechanisms there are to get their ballot cast, where are their polling locations, all these little things, people cannot show up and at local, state, or federal elections. When we don't show up, sometimes folks that do not align with our interests, that do not show up for us, that do not advocate for who we are in our lived experiences, have a detrimental impact on our well-being, our dignity, and our safety, right? And so we have seen that quite a bit in the last 4 years. Next slide. So what is Vote Positive USA? You know, with all that, you know, election 2020 in mind, we know elections have consequences. Why have we come together to create Vote Positive USA? Well, who we are a network of women and people of transgender experience living with HIV across the United States. We have leaders that are active in anchor teams in 9 different states, including Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan. We have 2 teams in Texas, and even more. And we are also composed of thousands of individuals across the nation that our anchor teams have brought together, that have mobilized these individuals to do political education on voting efforts, as well as engaging folks in GOTV organizing. Next slide. So how do we do this work? Well, the VPU, so Vote Positive USA, I might refer to it as VPU often. The VPU is conducted via an integrated voter engagement model. And so what some call an integrated voter engagement model is what we do every day, right? It's what the community living with HIV does. Like, we connect our real life issues and electoral organizing to build long-term power, fueled by our love for our families, our communities, and our vision of justice. You know, we know what it takes to mobilize what have been called hard to reach voters by other entities trying to get out the vote. We can mobilize these hard to reach voters because they are talking about us, right? Like, they're talking about folks living with HIV. They're talking about other marginalized communities. We know it's where we live, it's what we do, and everything is at stake in this election, especially for women and trans people living with HIV. And so it's up to us to really invest in our communities and show up this election. So this chart really breaks down the difference between traditional get out the vote efforts and what VPU is using, an integrated voter engagement, or IVE. And so in the traditional get out the vote methods, you know, it's where a national or an organization defines what the priority is. Typically that priority is a candidate's campaign or political parties. And the goal and the outcome of that priority is to win the election. After the election, either, you know, the campaign is gone regardless of the outcome, whether the candidate won or lost. But there's really no investment in sustainable long-term community mobilization for any subsequent elections, right? So this can sometimes be referred to as the parachuting in and out model, right? Where folks come in, mobilize us, and then once the deed is done, leave. With integrated voter engagement, we want to do community-based group work, right? Like, we are working for communities. We are mobilizing our communities on our behalf. You know, our goals and outcomes are to build lists of engaged community members. We want to develop new leaders who can lead this work. We want to educate and persuade our community to consistently show up. And we just want to build folks' power, right? No one else is going to come do the work for us. We got to do it ourselves and make sure that it lasts beyond us. And after the election, we want to make sure the group is still here, following up with community and holding decision makers accountable, right? In traditional GOTV, in the traditional GOTV model, once people leave, there isn't that accountability. We got who we wanted in power, arguably, but are they actually going to live up to the policy or the decision? Or will they live up to the stances that they said they would, right? So it's up to community to hold those decision makers accountable. And that's what the integrated voter engagement model allows for. Next slide. So the expected outcomes of our IVE work, there's 4 that we have identified, and these outcomes ensure a sustainable and truly community-led movement. You know, we have expanding the electorate, we want to build our base, we want to strengthen leadership and elevate HIV community priorities. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide just for time. So, and we wanted to highlight 3 case studies of 3 of our VPU teams thus far. And the first one is Houston and Harris County. They have been doing a lot of great work on community education. And I wanted to share this one example. It's called a Karen and Kevin's Guide to Government. And yes, that is based on the meme where, you know, you've heard like Karen asked to see the manager to get answers for things that like Karen is mad about. Well, you know, we were seeing in our community, like, folks don't know who to go to when certain things are happening, right? Like For example, we have a particular judicial nominee before the Senate that has made decisions that are not great for folks living with HIV, for folks that maybe want access to healthcare under the ACA, right? And this nominee wants to roll that accessibility back or just eliminate it. Well, Karen should call her senator and say, hey, I don't support this nominee, do something about it, right? So we're doing that kind of community education to let folks know, like, elected officials matter, and like we like who we put in power, these elected officials, impact our day-to-day lives. We're also doing community education in the form of Facebook Lives on curbside voting, early voting, and even more ways to vote during the primary. Because as other presenters have, brought up, this pandemic has dramatically changed the way that folks, I think, show up in elections, and it changes what is considered voting safely. Our Houston and Harris team, Harris County team, has also done get out the vote efforts in phone banking and text banking, and they're currently reaching unregistered Black and Latinx community members in Harris County. Again, typically the hard to reach folks that a lot of others tend to ignore. So right now we're focusing in Texas on registering folks to vote and ensuring that are checking up on their status, right? Because some folks might be like, oh, I am registered to vote. But as we've seen in other states, a lot of voter registration roles are getting purged. And so we are trying to tell folks that check your status. Like, are you actually registered to vote? If not, here's how to register to vote, and to do so prior to the deadline. After that, this team will flip to voter mobilization to get folks out to vote as safely as possible. Next slide. I wanted to share this really great voter guide that the Houston Harris County team put together during the Texas primary. Just real quick, it was so good. And many of our other teams will be putting similar voter guides out in their respective states, like Colorado, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Texas. Many others will be developing their voter guides that y'all can look at and share with your communities when they're out. Next slide. So I also want to highlight Pennsylvania. During the Pennsylvania primary, our team there was educating folks about the mail-in ballot options and worked and monitored polling places, which was quite exciting. But they also did education on vote by mail via virtual phone banks, informing voters to request their ballot and send it in ASAP. We already know that in Pennsylvania that folks are receiving their mail-in ballots. And as you can guess, with current events and a lot of discussion, folks might not really know, is their vote going to be counted by vote by mail? How do they, what is the best way to deliver it and ensure that it gets counted? Our Pennsylvania team is doing that kind of education for community via these virtual phone banks. And then they're also doing additional community education on mail-in voting with priorities for Black voters and low turnout Philly zip codes. Next slide. And then our last case study I wanted to highlight is Colorado. Our Colorado team is mobilizing voters in the Denver metro area and the Western Slope, which is a typically rural area of Colorado. Our team is leading virtual phone and text banks targeting those areas. And it was really interesting to hear the other day that our VPU teams, Pennsylvania and Colorado, VPU is hosting pretty much a phone bank every single day, right? Every day, I think, but Monday. So our Colorado team has about 3 phone banks per week, and they are hitting up folks in the Denver metro area and Western Slope and telling them, about like vote by mail and how to send in their ballots. And they're also doing issue-based advocacy. Our Colorado team is heavily invested and involved with many propositions, and I just wanted to highlight 2. One is Proposition 115 in Colorado that's on the ballot for the general. And what that is, that proposition would ban abortion after 22 weeks in the state, and it would criminalize doctors that perform abortions. And they're also working on Proposition 118, which would expand paid medical and family leave in Colorado. So our folks are calling their community, letting them know about these propositions, the impact they would have, and to be aware that they are on the ballot, right? Like we should be educating folks about what their ballot is, about down ballot races, about propositions or issues that will be on the ballot, and inform our community what they do, how it impacts them, and possibly which way they should vote. But next slide. So there's a lot more that VPU is doing that I was not able to get to. And you can actually join our work. So you can sign up for VPU updates via our website, which is actually in the template, and I'll plop it in the chat box. We also just started a weekly elections newsletter where we every week we send out some information on a voter-related thing. For example, our first one was on voter registration, and it provided a link to check if you actually registered to vote in your state, and if not, it tells you how. So you should sign up for that. You can also volunteer for one of our virtual phone and text banks. We also have a pledge to vote in 2020, which AIDS United actually has on their website, but you can also take it on ours. And I will provide all of these links to all of these things in the chat. Next slide. Finally, we also have an upcoming event next week on September 17th called Carrying Our Message, and we're leading a presentation on how to talk to voters when they say that they don't want, that their vote doesn't count and that they don't feel empowered in voting in this election. We want to really dispel a lot of those myths and empower folks to participate in the general, right? And so this presentation is next week. I will provide the link, and we hope you can join us. Next slide. And that's that. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Breanna, and also thanks to Anoa and Maxx for these great presentations. Before we get to the Q&A portion, I just want to point out, again, bombarding you with future events. AIDS Watch Road to Resiliency is going to be on September 29th and 30th. It is going to be a fall edition of our AIDS Watch platform that we usually do every March. But given COVID-19 and all the amazing issues that folks really have shown interest in engaging with, we are having a second AIDS Watch on September 29th and 30th. The link to register is below, but it will include another panel on electoral organizing, but also a number of other issues around the intersection of COVID and HIV. In terms of the question and answer session, before we get to the actual questions, I want to point out in the webinar chat, Lizzie Bellamy just wanted to point out that we want people to know that liberation they're looking for is so tied up in their vote, and asks, are there any suggestions on how we can tie those two things together? The tying up the sort of liberation of people with HIV and communities of color, and the power of the vote. If maybe, Max, if you want to get started on that, maybe?
Yeah. So I want to be very careful in how we talk about that. Voting is a tool. It is a tool that gets us, that does a harm reduction tactic in order for us to get closer to the goal of liberation. And I think it helps us be able to keep our folks healthier. I think, and many times when I'm talking to folks and they're saying, oh, I'm not sure, man, my vote's not gonna count. They always taking my vote off the rolls. I'm not sure. I'm gonna talk to them about, hey, them traffic tickets, and the importance of like who and which is important within their court system. I'm talking to them about those local things, such as like who's gonna make sure the sidewalks are done. Who, the local legislator, the city council folks. I'm talking to them about they local state representatives, state senators. And then we can talk about some of the bigger things with those folks. But I want them to understand some of the small things, local tickets, how long folks, who's in control of the different courts, the jails, the police departments. Those are important things for folks to think about. Who's in charge of making sure housing and rent stay, at a certain price. Those are the things that I want to talk to them about, the real issues that are important to them. And then we can start to talk about why that vote then matters.
Anoa and Breanna, any thoughts?
I would just add just to what Max said, because Max said all the things already, that just thinking about, like he said, holistically, like how we step people, but like we need to stop telling people like the vote itself is the end, like that's going to solve all of our issues and problems. And it's also another reason, like in your own organizing work, to step more into the civic engagement space and be working with and building with people around these issues year round, and not simply at election time because the sky is falling and you need to vote for this one specific thing, right? Like, so there are a lot of organizations that are starting to do more of that specific work, but also not just like showing up in terms of the presidential elections. I think Maxx already touched on this as well in terms of local elections, but it's really crucial when we're talking about like, this is tied to potential liberation, and we're also doing in our own work, how are we building alternatives that are actually moving us forward and involving people, like co-governance as well, is something that we should be talking more about. So I know a lot of folks who do C3 work tend to shy away from anything that involves politics and governance and stuff, but there are still ways, even within the C3 lane, that you could still be involved in conversations around what is co-governance looking like. So if we're bringing our whole collective to come vote on for you in this particular election, we're gonna also be back after the election, because these are the different things that you need to be following through for our community. So we need to be building those pipelines and those through lines, not just getting people to the polls, but what happens afterwards.
So just for the next question, I know Breanna mentioned in her presentation a few different propositions in Colorado around abortion access and paid family leave. In that vein, what are the issues that, I guess starting with Breanna and then going to the other presenters, that you think, I know wide eyes, that you think are going to be really crucial to people living with HIV and people affected by HIV in this election? What are the issues that when you're talking to folks really get their ears perked up?
So what are the issues that will be impacting people living with HIV in this election? All of them, but I like it, like literally everything. But I'm definitely sitting with, access to healthcare, right? Like there's been a huge push, I think, forever in the HIV community, and especially in light of COVID-19, like the need for universal healthcare, or for at the very least, like Medicare for all, expanded Medicaid in states that do have ACA. The livelihood, or just the life of healthcare in America, I think, is at stake. And that's definitely one issue that will impact the HIV community amongst, all the issues.
Yeah, going off that point, I definitely think healthcare is a big point. I would tell anyone I would not vote for a candidate that thinks it's okay that 200,000 people have died in this country according to COVID-19. I think that, and making sure that in the last piece, the last slide I had, it says we deserve to be healthy. Our folks deserve to be like at bare minimum healthy. And I think that also includes access to medication is an important thing for folks right now. Will they still have access to future parts around telehealth and moving forward? Are we going to be able to expand Medicaid, especially in these southern states? Are they going to be the ones that actually, win folks that look like Breanna, Anoa, and myself are being impacted by something? Are they going to just let it and keep it going, or are they going to say these are structural barriers that are actually causing those problems? And are the elected people going to follow the science? Those are, I think, all the things that are important right now as we're talking to especially people living with HIV that are doing this work, but also just general things. Are they going to make sure that we got jobs? Because that's outside of COVID, outside of HIV, is like everyone is also worried about the economic impact of all of this. And hey, are we going to make sure that, employment, or at least I'm not going to be worried about getting evicted? Making sure that housing is a big thing right now, making sure that they have access to that. And lastly, because again, majority of the new diagnoses are young Black folks, and any policy that is impacting Black folks is something that they are voting on right now, and that includes the overall piece around criminal justice reform, housing, healthcare, and as Breanna said, like all of it.
All right, thanks. And we're coming up against time, but we have one last question that I wanted to get to folks before we wrap up. And that sort of gets to the broader sort of tiredness that a lot of folks are feeling right now. I know in Max's remarks, he mentioned Freedom Summer. and thinking about sort of the parallels between 1964 and today, and sort of the fatigue that folks must have been feeling then, with the Vietnam War raging and with the sort of backlash of white supremacy against the civil rights movement then and Barry Goldwater. There's a lot of parallels to the current moment. I guess in parting, what would you say to folks that are feeling discouraged about sort of the possibilities that are inherent in this moment in time, and why folks need to engage with their community and really step up and vote, and not as something in and of itself, but as a means to an end, as Anoa said earlier?
I would just, suggest that when we're talking about voting and keeping people engaged, I mean, having really good verifiable information that we can share with folks about how to show up in this moment. And like Maxx and Breanna have both shared, like how to connect it to the work that you already have been doing or are stepping up and starting to do. I mean, helping people see the connections is really helpful. I mean, I know that's what I do, just even my own personal life with my siblings. One of my brothers voted for the first time in 2018 for Stacey Abrams when he was turning 30, because he really saw the importance and value for his own direct life. So I think we just talk to people, straight up. I mean, when we think about what's happening right now in Congress and how we have not had any more COVID-19 relief or any relief for employment or a whole, we tie it to the real means and conditions of folks' lives, and we keep building with them. We don't just touch them this one time and then walk away.
Brianna, you want to go? Or
Uplifting, you go for it.
There's so much that has happened in 2020. I can understand someone being tired, and I can also understand the ads about to get real. They only gonna get uglier and worse. But even though we know that, we also know that our folks are that the soul of America is up to stake. How in which we think about moving forward in the United States and getting closer, if it's liberation, if it's just getting the feds or the insurance folks or the different things that getting them or the police off of our literal necks. It is important right now for us to be able to exercise that right to vote. And coming out of my Congressman John Lewis's district and understanding the fight that he continuously did, I'm not trying to make someone feel bad to go vote. I'm saying, hey, come do this with me. Come do this with us so we can build something better in the future. And I'm not saying that what will come of on November 3rd or the week of whatever actually we decide what's going to happen. We ain't going to, that's not going to get us finally there, but let's get us in a step in the right direction.
Everything Maxx said, it's so hard to top everything that he just said. But I echo that 100%. I always fall back on, nobody's going to speak for my community but me. No one's going to show up for anyone but me and but us. And I think it's critical that we show up on the 3rd, because as Maxx said, I think the soul of our country is at stake. I think our safety, well-being, and dignity is as well. And I encourage folks to show up, to cast their vote, to participate in a form of harm reduction, and then to continue the long fight, to invest in this, and to hold those accountable to ensure that they meet our needs.
All right, before we officially close, I just want to say a huge thanks to all of our presenters. If you don't already, follow Anoa's work at Prism, and her Twitter profile is great, at The Way with Anoa on Twitter. Breanna, everything that she does and that Positive Women's Network USA does is fantastic. Follow them on Twitter, on Facebook, get with Vote Positive USA, and by all means, check out the Wheel of People plan on Black AIDS Institute's website and all the amazing work they're doing, especially on Instagram. They have a ton of great content in terms of sort of webinars and content there that I think folks on this webinar would like to engage in if they don't already. And finally, AIDS Watch, Road to Resiliency, September 29th and 30th. I registered on the website. This is just one step in a really long journey. And I'm really glad that folks could show up and show out for this, and stay tuned for more. Thanks everyone so much.